We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The bells of St. Augustine's rang out across the sleepy town of Fairhope, Alabama, on the morning of March 7, 2004. The small coastal community, population just under 18,000 at the time, gathered as they always did on Sundays, filtering into the red brick church that had stood on Magnolia Avenue since 1911. The spring air smelled faintly of salt drifting in from Mobile Bay, and azaleas had just begun to bloom, their pink blossoms crowding along white picket fences. For most residents, the day began with routine comfort, the same hymns, the same pews, the same familiar nods exchanged between neighbors. But for one young woman, it would be the last Sunday anyone would see her alive. Her name was Emily Harper, 22 years old, the daughter of a local carpenter and a school librarian. Known for her quiet determination and musical gift, Emily had played piano for the church choir since she was 16. She carried herself with a gentle humility that drew people to her without effort, polite, warm-eyed, always arriving early to adjust hymnals and warm up the church organ keys before service. That Sunday, congregants later recalled, Emily wore a pale lavender dress with a pearl clip pinning back her dark hair. Several people remembered complimenting her smile as she slipped into the front pew to prepare for the offertory hymn. The service began at 10 a.m. sharp. Reverend Charles Mayfield delivered his sermon on forgiveness, his baritone echoing through the vaulted wooden beams of the old sanctuary. Emily's music lifted the sermon beyond words, the chords from her piano rolling through the aisles with a serenity that hushed even restless children. The choir director, Mrs. Bennett, would later insist she'd never heard Emily play so beautifully, like she was reaching for something far away, something final, she recalled. By 11:45 a.m., as the congregation filed out into the sunlight, Emily was seen chatting with friends on the church steps. She laughed, promised to stop by choir practice later in the week, and checked her wristwatch. Her leather handbag, tan, slightly scuffed from years of use, rested on the steps beside her. Witnesses remembered that she gathered her things, waved goodbye, and started the short half-mile walk home down Sycamore Street. That walk should have taken her less than 10 minutes. But Emily never arrived. At 12:32 p.m., her handbag was discovered still sitting on the stone steps of St. Augustine's. Inside were her wallet, driver's license, a small cosmetic pouch, and her keyring. Strangely, the keychain included both her front door key and her car keys. The bag appeared undisturbed, no signs of struggle, no contents scattered. At first, parishioners assumed Emily had simply forgotten it. But by evening, when she failed to return for choir rehearsal, alarm began to spread. Her mother, Karen Harper, grew worried when Emily didn't answer the landline. By 6 p.m., Karen drove the short distance to Emily's small rented bungalow, a white clapboard house at the edge of a pecan orchard. The driveway was empty, but the garage door was closed. Karen used her spare key and let herself in. The house was quiet, immaculate as always, dishes drying on the rack, a half-finished music score lying open on the piano. Karen's heart tightened when she opened the garage. Emily's old blue Honda Civic sat parked neatly inside. The doors were locked. The keys, as Karen already knew, were in the handbag still at church. By 8:14 p.m., the Fairhope Police Department logged an official missing persons report. Patrol units canvassed Sycamore Street with flashlights, retracing Emily's path from church to home. Neighbors reported seeing her pass by around noon, her lavender dress bright in the sun, but none saw her reach her driveway. Somewhere along that familiar route, just 6 blocks, Emily Harper had vanished. Detective Mark Ellison, a 10-year veteran of the Baldwin County Sheriff's Department, was assigned the case. He arrived at the Harper residence late that evening, his notepad already filling with observations. Emily's car in the garage puzzled him immediately. If she'd walked home, she hadn't needed it, but why had she left her keys behind? And if she'd intended to drive somewhere later, why lock the car securely only to disappear on foot? The handbag seemed staged, its careful placement on the church steps too neat, too deliberate. The first 24 hours yielded more questions than answers. No signs of forced entry at her house. No witnesses reporting suspicious vehicles or strangers on Sycamore. No evidence of robbery. Her wallet contained cash, her credit cards unused. Police dogs brought to the scene failed to pick up a reliable scent. The trail ended abruptly 2 blocks from the church near a vacant lot where grass grew high around a rusting swing set. By Monday morning, March 8th, the case had already gripped Fairhope. Flyers with Emily's photo, Dark eyes, soft smile, appeared on telephone poles and gas station windows. Local radio hosts interrupted country music sets to plead for information. Volunteers, including church members, scoured the woods and bay shorelines. But as searchers waded through marsh grass and turned over driftwood along the shore, whispers began to ripple through the town. Some whispered about David Langford, Emily's ex-boyfriend, who had grown bitter after their breakup the previous fall. Others speculated about a drifter seen hitchhiking near Highway 98 earlier that weekend. Still others lowered their voices when they mentioned the unsettling idea that someone inside the church community itself might be responsible. Detective Ellison pursued every lead with steady determination. He interviewed choir members, examined the guest book, traced Emily's last phone calls. At 11:07 a.m. on March 7th, records showed she had called her mother from the church office phone, just a short check-in, nothing unusual. No outgoing calls after that. Her cell phone, an early 2000s Nokia, was found on her bedroom nightstand, fully charged. Forensics combed the handbag and the Honda Civic. No fingerprints besides Emily's and her mother's. No signs of tampering with the garage lock. The Civic's odometer reading suggested the car hadn't been driven since Friday evening. It was as if Emily had stepped off the church steps and dissolved into the spring air. But by Tuesday afternoon, the first thread of evidence appeared. A neighbor living near the vacant lot reported hearing a woman scream around noon on Sunday, followed by the sharp slam of a vehicle door. He had dismissed it at the time. Sunday afternoons were filled with family arguments and teenagers blasting music, but now the memory prickled with dread. He recalled seeing a pale sedan, maybe a Toyota or Nissan, speeding away toward Highway 181. The detail was thin, unreliable, but it was enough to jolt the investigation into a broader search. Meanwhile, Karen Harper transformed her grief into relentless action. She quit her library shifts, set up a command post in her living room with maps of Baldwin County pinned to the walls, and coordinated volunteers in daily searches. "If the police can't find her, then I will," she told reporters, her voice brittle with exhaustion. She called television stations and mobile, contacted the National Center for Missing Adults, and printed hundreds of flyers from her own pocket. The community rallied, but as days stretched into weeks, hope began to fray. By April 2004, the Fairhope police labeled Emily's case suspicious missing, a step short of officially declaring foul play. Detective Ellison, however, confided to Karen that he believed something darker had happened. "People don't just vanish between a church and their front porch," he said. "Someone made her disappear." What nobody realized was that the investigation into Emily Harper's disappearance would stretch far beyond Baldwin County, drawing in the Alabama State Bureau of Investigation, federal forensics, and eventually, the breakthroughs of modern DNA science. For now, the trail was faint: a lavender dress last seen in sunlight, a handbag on the steps of faith, and a locked car waiting silently in a garage that its owner would never return to. The second week of Emily Harper's disappearance unfolded like a slow descent into nightmare for the town of Fairhope. What began as a hopeful community search effort turned, day by day, into an atmosphere of suspicion, whispered theories, and a growing conviction that something sinister had unfolded in broad daylight on Sycamore Street. Detective Mark Ellison had long since abandoned any notion that Emily had left voluntarily. Her routines were too consistent, her nature too reliable. She was the kind of young woman who phoned her mother if she'd be 10 minutes late, who left post-it notes on her refrigerator reminding herself to water the gardenias. People like Emily did not vanish on whimsy. For Ellison, the locked car in the garage remained the most haunting detail. It was a symbol of interruption, her normal life, paused mid-note like the half-finished music score left on her piano. The early suspects, the first wave of suspicion, fell naturally on David Langford, Emily's ex-boyfriend. They had dated through her sophomore and junior years of college, a relationship that neighbors described as intense but unstable. David was a wiry, dark-haired mechanic with a reputation for a temper. He'd been seen outside Emily's house several times in the months after their breakup, sometimes leaving flowers, sometimes pounding on the door late at night. Ellison tracked David down at his auto shop in Daphne, 20 minutes north. David looked haggard, grease smeared across his hands, his voice defensive from the start. "I didn't touch her," he repeated during the 3-hour interview. "Yeah, I was mad when she left. But that was months ago. I'm over it." He insisted he'd spent March 7th working in his garage, repairing a transmission for a client named Walker, who later confirmed the alibi. Still, David's history of jealousy made him an easy target for gossip. By mid-March, half the town was convinced he'd dragged Emily into that pale sedan. Another name emerged, Reverend Charles Mayfield, the 52-year-old pastor of St. Augustine's. He had delivered the sermon that morning, shaking hands on the church steps as Emily disappeared. Some whispered that his pastoral concern for Emily had edged into inappropriate attention. Others pointed to the fact that he had been one of the last to see her alive. When detectives questioned him, Mayfield bristled at the insinuation. "Emily was like a daughter to me," he said, his voice breaking. He provided a detailed timeline of his afternoon: lunch with parishioners, hospital visits, evening prayers. Records and witnesses confirmed it. Still, suspicion clung to him in quiet corners of Fairhope. Then there was the neighbor's account: the scream, the car door, the pale sedan. Police began cataloging every vehicle in Baldwin County that matched the description, knocking on doors, photographing license plates. They came up with dozens of possibilities, but no definitive lead. The community response: as the days stretched into weeks, Fairhope transformed. The town square, once a place of spring festivals and Saturday farmers markets, now hosted candlelight vigils for Emily. Choir members sang hymns under flickering flames, their voices trembling in the evening air. Hand-drawn posters with Emily's photograph, her soft smile, her pearl hair clip, covered every shop window and gas pump. But beneath the solidarity, fractures grew. At Rosie's Cafe, the morning coffee crowd divided sharply. Some argued that David Langford was guilty, his temper too notorious to ignore. Others defended him, pointing to his alibi. Old friendships frayed under the weight of speculation. Mrs. Weaver, who had taught Emily piano as a child, accused the police of dragging their feet. "If she were from a wealthy family," she said bitterly to a reporter, "they'd have half the FBI here already." The Harper family's grief became the town's daily theater. Karen Harper, Emily's mother, set up a folding table outside the Piggly Wiggly with stacks of flyers. She handed them to strangers, pressed them into windshields, mailed them to news stations in Birmingham and Atlanta. Her eyes grew hollow, her voice sharper with each passing day. "Somebody knows something," she repeated like a prayer. Her husband, Don Harper, retreated inward, spending hours in his workshop sanding pieces of unfinished furniture. Neighbors described the family home as a place where silence had become a form of survival. The first media wave: by late March, regional media had descended. Satellite trucks lined Magnolia Avenue. Reporters prowled the church steps where Emily's handbag had been found, their bright lights harsh against the old red bricks. National outlets soon followed, fascinated by the eerie details: the handbag left behind, the car locked in the garage, the young pianist vanishing between hymnals and home. For Detective Ellison, the media brought pressure but also leads. Dozens of calls poured in from across Alabama, sightings of women who looked like Emily. A waitress in Montgomery, a motel clerk in Pensacola, a college student in Tuscaloosa. Ellison drove hundreds of miles, chasing each glimmer of hope, only to find dead ends. Each false lead wore him thinner, but none more than the call from a trucker who swore he'd seen Emily hitchhiking near Mobile. The woman turned out to be a runaway from Louisiana. Forensics continued to frustrate investigators. The handbag showed nothing unusual. The church steps offered no usable prints beyond dozens of congregants. The Civic's interior was spotless. Even the vacant lot, scoured by cadaver dogs, yielded nothing more than discarded beer cans and children's toys. But one detail nagged at Ellison: a single set of tire impressions near the vacant lot, photographed on March 7th before searchers trampled the ground. The tracks belonged to a mid-sized sedan, likely a Toyota Camry or Nissan Altima. The impressions suggested new tires, deep treads. Ellison circulated the photographs to every dealership and repair shop in Baldwin County. Nothing surfaced. Rumors and revelations. By April, rumors had become the town's currency. Some swore Emily had run away to start fresh, tired of small-town scrutiny. Others whispered of a secret relationship with a married man. A darker theory spread through hushed conversations: that Emily had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see, illegal activity, perhaps even within the church community, and had been silenced. One revelation rattled investigators. Emily's close friend Sarah Collins, a fellow choir member, confided that Emily had seemed unusually tense the week before she vanished. She had asked Sarah strange questions. "Do you think people can hide who they really are? And if something happened to me, would anyone believe it wasn't my fault?" Sarah dismissed it at the time as nerves over an upcoming recital. Now, she replayed those words with dread. Detective Ellison pressed deeper. Emily's phone records revealed a string of late-night calls to an unlisted number in the weeks before her disappearance. Tracing it led to a payphone near a truck stop off I-10. Why would Emily be calling a payphone? And who had been on the other end? The shifting seasons as spring deepened into summer, azaleas gave way to magnolias, and the search for Emily took on the rhythm of ritual. Volunteers combed bay shorelines every Saturday. Police helicopters swept fields. Yet the void remained. Karen Harper's face grew sharper, her cheeks hollow from weight loss. She carried a binder of maps and timelines everywhere, confronting detectives, pestering reporters. Her voice on the evening news grew hoarse. Somebody took my daughter. She did not leave us. Fairhope itself seemed to hold its breath. The pew where Emily once sat remained empty, flowers laid there each Sunday. The piano keys gathered dust. The sound of hymns felt thinner, like the church itself knew something had been stolen from it. By August 2004, Emily Harper's disappearance had been officially reclassified as a cold case in waiting. Detective Ellison refused to let it go, but resources shifted. Other crimes demanded attention. Files piled high on his desk. Still, every night before leaving the station, he touched the folder with Emily's name, as if promising her he would not forget. What nobody knew was that the first true break in the case, the first hint of how Emily had vanished, was already sitting in evidence storage, waiting for science that didn't yet exist to reveal its truth. By the winter of 2005, the Harper case had become less of an active investigation and more of a shadow hanging over Fairhope. For nearly a year, the community had searched, speculated, prayed, and whispered. But now the posters had begun to fade in the sun, their edges curling on telephone poles. The church pew where Emily Harper once sat still carried flowers each Sunday, but fewer people paused to notice. Life, cruelly persistent, insisted on moving forward, even as Emily's family and Detective Mark Ellison remained suspended in the day she vanished. A detective-consumed Detective Ellison sat most nights in his office, long after other deputies had gone home. His desk was no longer a workspace but a shrine to the missing pianist. Photographs pinned to corkboards, maps traced with highlighter, stacks of interview transcripts dog-eared and smudged with coffee rings. The odometer on his county-issued Crown Victoria told the story of endless miles logged across Baldwin County, chasing leads that evaporated in his hands. His colleagues muttered about obsession. Sheriff Anita Caldwell had warned him gently in December, "Mark, you've got to step back. We can't let one case sink the whole department." But Ellison could not let go. The handbag on the church steps, the Civic locked in the garage, the lavender dress in the spring sun, it gnawed at him. "People don't just disappear," he told his reflection late at night, staring at himself in the darkened window. Somebody made her disappear. A family fractured for Karen and Don Harper. The first anniversary of Emily's disappearance was an open wound. On March 7, 2005, they organized a candlelight vigil at St. Augustine's. Nearly 300 people gathered, candles flickering in the cool evening air. Hymns rose into the night, carried on the breeze toward Mobile Bay. Reporters covered it, but the coverage was thinner, the cameras fewer. The national outlets that had once swarmed Fairhope now chased newer tragedies. Karen spoke at the vigil, her voice breaking. "My daughter was taken from us, and I won't stop until we know the truth. If you know something, anything, come forward." Her plea echoed off the church's red brick walls, but no new witnesses stepped forward. At home, the Harpers' marriage strained under grief. Karen's relentless energy, her flyers, her binders, her daily calls to investigators, clashed with Don's retreat into silence. He spent hours in his workshop sanding furniture, his hands busy while his heart stayed locked away. Friends noticed that the once warm Harper house had grown cold, its windows often dark, its doors rarely open to company. Community suspicion in Fairhope, suspicion lingered like humidity. Neighbors eyed one another differently. Some still swore that David Langford was guilty, his temper too notorious to ignore. Others whispered about the pastor, Reverend Mayfield, despite his alibi. Still others turned their suspicion inward, wondering whether someone in their own pews, their own neighborhoods, had hidden a monstrous secret all along. Rosie's Cafe banned Emily talk during the breakfast rush after arguments grew heated enough to nearly come to blows. "People you've known all your life," Rosie muttered, "suddenly looking at you like you're hiding a body in your backyard." The absence of answers created fertile soil for rumors. Some insisted Emily had run off to start over, weary of small-town scrutiny. Others claimed she discovered something dark, affairs, fraud, or worse, within the church community. Each theory carried its believers, its defenders, and its deniers. A false dawn in May 2005, a glimmer of hope appeared. A gas station clerk in Montgomery reported seeing a young woman who looked like Emily. The woman had come in late at night, bought a bottle of water, and left quickly. Surveillance footage was grainy, but the figure resembled Emily, her build, her dark hair. Ellison drove the 2.5 hours to Montgomery, his heart pounding. The footage, when reviewed in detail, collapsed under scrutiny. The woman was shorter than Emily, her gait different. The lead dissolved, another cruel mirage. Ellison drove back to Fairhope at 3 a.m., the empty highway stretching before him like punishment. He pulled into his driveway and sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. The case grows cold by summer. The Baldwin County Sheriff's Department officially downgraded the Harper file to inactive pending new evidence. Resources were limited, and other cases demanded attention: burglaries, drug operations, domestic violence calls. The announcement hit Karen like a blow. She stormed into the sheriff's office, binder in hand, demanding answers. "How can you stop looking? She's my daughter," she cried. Sheriff Caldwell listened quietly, her expression weary. "We're not stopping, ma'am," she said softly. "We're waiting. There's a difference." But for Karen, waiting was unbearable. She began contacting private investigators, scouring online crime forums, writing letters to psychics. Each offered hope, each demanded money, each ultimately delivered nothing. Still, she pressed on. "If I stop, she dies twice," she told a local newspaper. A town haunted by fall of 2005, the Harper case had transformed from news into legend. Teenagers whispered about Emily on sleepovers, daring each other to walk Sycamore Street at night. Some swore they heard piano music drifting from her empty bungalow. The vacant lot where her trail ended became a place of dread, its rusting swing set creaking in the wind. Parents warned children not to play there, as if evil itself lingered in the grass. St. Augustine's felt her absence most acutely. The piano keys gathered dust, their silence louder than any hymn. Choir practice never regained its old rhythm. Mrs. Bennett, the choir director, often stared at the empty bench before beginning rehearsals. "It's like a limb missing," she confided. "The music just doesn't sound right without her." Detective Ellison's breaking point. By December 2005, Ellison's obsession had begun to erode him. His hair thinned, his suits hung looser. He missed birthdays, skipped social gatherings, drank too much coffee and too little water. Colleagues whispered about burnout. Some suggested reassignment. But Ellison refused. "If I leave this case," he told Sheriff Caldwell, "I leave her. And I won't do that." At home, his marriage suffered. His wife, tired of dinners eaten cold and nights spent alone, accused him of loving Emily Harper's ghost more than his own family. He had no answer. Nights found him at his kitchen table, staring at tire tread photographs, retracing Emily's steps again and again in his mind, as if repetition could summon revelation. On the first anniversary of Emily's disappearance, Ellison stood alone at the vacant lot. The swing set creaked in the breeze, the grass long and damp with dew. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine it: the lavender dress, the handbag on the church steps, the sudden scream. He swore he could still feel it, a presence lingering, a puzzle unsolved. "I'll find you," he whispered into the night. "I swear it." What he could not know then was that the truth, the real explanation for Emily Harper's disappearance, would remain buried for more than a decade, waiting for science and persistence to collide. For now, Fairhope lived under the shadow of her absence, a small town with a missing pianist and a mystery that refused to fade. By the spring of 2006, 2 years had passed since Emily Harper's lavender dress disappeared between the church steps and her white-clapboard bungalow. Fairhope had learned to live around the absence. Children still played baseball in the park, couples still strolled down Magnolia Avenue, and St. Augustine still filled its pews every Sunday morning. But the name Emily Harper carried a weight now, a reminder that even in a town where neighbors waved at each passing car, darkness could bloom in daylight and remain unsolved. The cold case label on March 7, 2006, exactly 2 years after Emily vanished, the Baldwin County Sheriff's Department reclassified her file. The Harper investigation was no longer inactive, pending new evidence. It was now cold case #04-217, a number inked on a beige file folder that slid onto a shelf in the evidence room. For Karen Harper, the reclassification felt like betrayal. At a press conference outside the sheriff's office, Sheriff Anita Caldwell stood at the podium, the spring sun reflecting off the badge pinned to her chest. "We remain committed to justice for Emily Harper," she said. "But at this time, without new leads or evidence, we must reallocate resources. The case remains open. It is not closed. Any new information will be pursued aggressively." Karen stood in the crowd, binder clutched to her chest, her lips pressed thin. She whispered to a reporter afterward, "When they say cold case, what they really mean is forgotten case." Detective Ellison's descent, Detective Mark Ellison, heard the words as a death knell. For 2 years he had poured every ounce of his life into Emily's disappearance. He had chased hundreds of tips, interviewed every resident within a 10-mile radius, compiled binders of theories. And yet he had no body, no suspect, no closure. The cold case designation came with a personal blow. Ellison was reassigned. Sheriff Caldwell explained it gently. He was needed elsewhere. Burglaries and narcotics cases were piling up. "You'll still be the point man if anything breaks," she promised. But Ellison heard only the unspoken truth: "You failed." At night, he sat alone in his living room surrounded by copies of the Harper file he had smuggled home. His wife had long since stopped asking when he would let go. His children avoided him, resentful of the ghost that haunted their dinner table. Ellison scribbled notes in the margins of old interviews, convinced that if he just read them one more time, some overlooked detail would leap out. The Harpers in survival mode for Karen and Don Harper. Year 3 without Emily was a blur of exhaustion. Karen's library job had been reduced to part-time, her hours consumed instead by advocacy. She attended every cold case conference she could find, traveling to Birmingham, Atlanta, even Dallas to sit in folding chairs among other grieving parents. She spoke about Emily at vigils, schools, and church groups. "Don't think it can't happen here," she told them. "Because it already has." Don, meanwhile, sank deeper into silence. He built chairs, tables, cabinets, anything to keep his hands moving. He sold them at flea markets, each piece polished to perfection. Friends whispered that he worked wood as if sanding away grief grain by grain. He rarely spoke about Emily anymore, but once, to a neighbor helping him load a cabinet, he muttered, "She's still out there. Somewhere." Community memory Fairhope itself had entered an uneasy rhythm. The swing set in the vacant lot where Emily's trail had ended rusted further, its chains squealing in the wind. Teenagers dared each other to sit on it after dark, swearing they heard faint piano notes when the wind carried just right. At St. Augustine's, the piano bench remained empty, a vase of fresh flowers placed there each Sunday. Reverend Mayfield began his sermons with a moment of silence, though over time fewer bowed their heads. The town still carried Emily's absence, but it had learned to fold it into its daily routine, like a scar that still ached when the weather changed. Rumors resurface in 2006, gossip reawakened. A drifter arrested for burglary in Mobile claimed to know what happened to that church girl in Fairhope. When pressed, he spun an elaborate story about a sex trafficking ring, about vans and highways. Investigators quickly unraveled it. He had fabricated the tale for leniency. Still, the rumor spread, fueling late-night conversations at Rosie's Cafe. David Langford, the ex-boyfriend, remained the town's favorite suspect. Though cleared repeatedly by Ellison, whispers persisted. "Boys like him don't just let go," one resident said. David, unable to endure the scrutiny, moved north to Birmingham by late 2006. He left behind only the rumors, which clung to him like a shadow he could never outrun. A new investigator in September 2007, Baldwin County quietly transferred Emily's file to Detective Carla Mendoza, a rising star in the department. Sharp-eyed, methodical, and less personally entangled than Ellison, she was tasked with reviewing the file for fresh perspective. Mendoza set up shop in a windowless office at the sheriff's annex, boxes of evidence stacked around her like walls. She read everything, every statement, every photograph, every dead-end lead. She found small inconsistencies. Mrs. Weaver, Emily's childhood piano teacher, had given 2 slightly different accounts of the last time she saw Emily. A parishioner's recollection of the service time conflicted with the church records. Minor cracks, but perhaps meaningful. Ellison bristled at Mendoza's involvement. He cornered her in the hallway one afternoon, voice low but sharp. This isn't just a file. It's a life. Don't treat it like paperwork. Mendoza didn't flinch. Then maybe you should have solved it, she replied coolly, walking away with the file under her arm. Karen's persistence. Karen Harper saw in Mendoza a chance. She brought her binders, her timelines, her boxes of flyers. I know it's a lot, she said, eyes burning with determination. But you'll see things they missed. I know you will. Mendoza listened patiently, even as her colleagues warned her not to get sucked into Karen's whirlpool of obsession. One evening, after hours, Mendoza lingered over the photograph of the tire tracks from the vacant lot. She traced the tread with her finger, the deep grooves in the mud. Something about them nagged at her. They weren't just new tires, they were unusually wide for a standard sedan. She made a note, possible aftermarket modification? It was a small observation, one that wouldn't yield fruit for years, but it marked the beginning of a new angle. The Case is a Mirror. By late 2007, Emily's case had become less about Emily herself and more about what she represented. For Fairhope, she was a reminder that safety was an illusion. For Karen, she was the engine of relentless purpose. For Don, she was the silence he carved into wood. For Ellison, she was the failure that haunted his career. And for Detective Mendoza, she was a puzzle demanding clarity, a riddle whose solution might lie not in new evidence but in reinterpreting the old. What none of them yet knew was that Emily Harper's story was not over. Evidence sat quietly in sealed bags, fibers and prints and photographs waiting for the technology of the future. And the man who held the truth, who had walked Fairhope streets with an unremarkable smile, still moved freely among them, his secret buried as deeply as Emily herself. By 2008, 4 years after Emily Harper vanished between the church steps and her bungalow, her case had settled into a rhythm of silence. The posters were gone, the vigils smaller, the news coverage faded. In Fairhope, time moved forward, but the empty pew at St. Augustine's and the rusted swing set in the vacant lot reminded everyone that some absences could not be paved over. A new detective's grip. Detective Carla Mendoza refused to let Emily's file collect dust. Younger than most of her colleagues, with sharp black hair always tied in a neat knot, she had earned a reputation for patience and meticulousness. She approached the Harper case not as a personal haunting, like Ellison had, but as a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered too widely. Her office walls in the sheriff's annex became layered with timelines and maps. She color-coded witness statements by reliability, marked inconsistencies in red ink, and pinned Polaroids of evidence to corkboard like a mosaic. Unlike Ellison, she didn't chase every wild lead. Instead, she reread and reinterpreted what was already in front of her. One detail she obsessed over was the handbag left on the church steps. Its placement had always been described as neat, almost staged. To Mendoza, that detail suggested intent. If someone grabbed her suddenly, the bag would have fallen spilled, she told her captain during a briefing. But it didn't. It was left. Deliberately. Another thread, the tire tracks in the vacant lot. Ellison had logged them as a mid-sized sedan, maybe a Camry or Altima. Mendoza noted the grooves were deeper than expected, slightly wider. Maybe aftermarket tires, she mused. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. Ellison in the shadows. Detective Mark Ellison, by then reassigned to burglary cases, could not let go. Colleagues found him in the evidence room after hours, staring at photographs of Emily's lavender dress on the church steps. His obsession had cost him dearly. His wife had filed for divorce, his children no longer returned his calls. He began showing up uninvited at Karen Harper's house, sitting at her kitchen table long past midnight, the two of them surrounded by binders of theories. They were united in grief and obsession, though Karen's energy still burned outward, rallies, flyers, calls to the press, while Ellison's burned inward, consuming him. By 2009, Sheriff Caldwell quietly pulled Ellison off any peripheral involvement in the Harper case. "You're too close," she told him. He stared at her for a long moment and replied, "Close is the only way to see the truth." Karen's transformation. If Ellison was crumbling, Karen Harper was evolving. By 2008, she had become a familiar face across Alabama, speaking at vigils for other missing persons, appearing on local TV, writing letters to lawmakers. She pushed for reforms to Alabama's system of handling cold cases, demanding more funding, more resources, better training. In April 2009, she testified before a state committee in Montgomery, clutching a framed photo of Emily in her lavender dress. My daughter didn't just vanish. She was taken. And every day without answers is a wound that never closes. We need to do better, for Emily, and for every family still waiting." Her voice cracked, but her message carried. Newspapers called her the relentless mother. Don Harper, quieter, stood beside her at press conferences but rarely spoke. At home, his workshop was now filled with dozens of unfinished pieces, chairs, cabinets, tables, wood frozen mid-shape, as if even his craft had surrendered to grief. Rumors and theories. By 2010, the Harper case had become the subject of online forums and early true crime blogs. Strangers from across the country pored over what few public details existed. Theories multiplied, that Emily had been abducted by a stranger passing through on Highway 98. That David Langford, despite his alibi, had orchestrated her disappearance. That someone inside St. Augustine's, perhaps even Reverend Mayfield, had hidden a darker life. That Emily had stumbled into a secret, something criminal, and been silenced. Each theory carried its disciples, and each reached Karen's inbox. She read them all, desperate for any thread, but most dissolved under scrutiny. Still, one detail lingered. Multiple posters on a crime forum claimed that pale sedans matching the witness description had been linked to unsolved abductions across the South. The connection was tenuous, but it whispered of a broader pattern. Mendoza's quiet discoveries. In late 2010, Detective Mendoza made a quiet but potentially crucial observation. She had been re-examining photographs of Emily's piano sheet music, left on her bungalow's stand the day she vanished. Most saw nothing but notes on a page. But Mendoza noticed faint smudges, tiny dark marks along the paper's edges, almost invisible. She ordered the sheet preserved for later testing, though current technology yielded nothing. At the same time, she revisited the church guest book from March 7, 2004. Among the neat rows of signatures, one stood out, a shaky hand scrawled R. Vance. At the time, it had seemed irrelevant, a nephew visiting an elderly congregant, Mrs. Vance. But Mendoza circled it in red. "Always pay attention to who inserts themselves into the scene," she noted in her file. She didn't yet know that this name would one day unlock the mystery. A town living with ghosts. By the end of 2010, Fairhope had learned to live with the ghost of Emily Harper. St. Augustine still placed flowers on her pew. The vacant lot grew over with weeds, the swing set collapsing in rust. Children whispered that her spirit haunted Sycamore Street. But the case remained unsolved. For Karen, it meant sleepless nights and endless speeches. For Don, it meant silence and unfinished wood. For Ellison, it meant a life hollowed out by obsession. And for Mendoza, it meant a puzzle that refused to resolve, though she sensed, deeply, that the answers already sat quietly in the file, waiting for the world to be ready to see them. Fairhope would wait nearly another decade before those answers finally came. By 2011, 7 years had passed since Emily Harper disappeared between a church and her home. Time had stretched the wound into scar tissue for most of Fairhope. The azaleas bloomed each spring, the bay still glittered under the Alabama sun, and Sunday bells continued to ring at St. Augustine's. But beneath the surface, the case had settled into the marrow of the town, a quiet, aching reminder that safety was fragile, that innocence could be stolen in an instant and never returned. Forgotten by headlines, national news had long since moved on. The satellite trucks were gone, the reporters chasing fresher tragedies. Even Alabama's regional stations rarely mentioned Emily's name anymore. Only on anniversaries did the story resurface briefly, a photo of Emily, the lavender dress, the unsolved mystery of a handbag on church steps. Then silence again. Karen Harper refused silence. Each March she organized a vigil, though attendance shrank each year. In 2005, there had been hundreds. By 2011, only a few dozen gathered, candles flickering in the night breeze. Karen still spoke, her voice hoarse from years of repeating the same plea: "Don't forget her. Please, don't let her vanish twice." Don Harper attended, but he rarely spoke. He stood at the back, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground. Friends whispered that he looked like a man who had already buried his daughter in his heart, though no grave existed. Detective Ellison, the spiral detective Mark Ellison, had become a cautionary tale within the sheriff's department. Colleagues whispered about him in hallways, the once solid investigator who had let a single case devour him. Officially, he handled burglary and property crimes. Unofficially, everyone knew he still lived inside the Harper file. His small rental house in Daphne had turned into a private archive. Boxes of photocopied reports lined his living room. Walls were plastered with maps, timelines, and photographs of Emily. He drank too much, slept too little. His divorce had finalized in 2010, his children grown distant. He lived for the puzzle, not for himself. In 2012, Ellison began showing up uninvited to church services at St. Augustine's, slipping into the back pew to watch the empty piano bench. Parishioners whispered nervously. Reverend Mayfield approached him gently one Sunday, suggesting he let the past rest. Ellison's reply was sharp, almost bitter. The past doesn't rest. It's buried alive, waiting to be dug up. That same year, Ellison was reprimanded for accessing the evidence room without clearance. He had been caught photographing old fibers and fingerprints from Emily's file, muttering about technology catching up. Sheriff Caldwell suspended him for a week. But nothing deterred him. Emily's ghost had replaced his career, his family, his life. Detective Mendoza, persistence in silence. Detective Carla Mendoza carried the Harper file differently. Where Ellison was fire, Mendoza was water, patient, methodical, slow erosion rather than explosion. In 2011, she requested advanced fingerprint reanalysis of Emily's handbag and piano sheet music using newer chemical techniques. The results came back inconclusive. No new prints, no breakthroughs. But Mendoza filed a request again in 2012, then again in 2013, each time hoping that the march of technology might catch something invisible before. She also re-examined the guestbook signature, R. Vance. At the time, the name was background noise, one of dozens of visitors that Sunday. But Mendoza had developed a habit of circling anomalies. She dug through DMV records, traced the name to Robert Vance, nephew of elderly parishioner Mrs. Elenina Vance. He had no criminal history, no obvious connection to Emily. Mendoza made a note in her logbook, keep an eye on him. Karen Harper, the advocate. By 2013, Karen Harper had transformed her grief into activism. She became a familiar face at missing persons conferences across the Southeast. She appeared on true crime podcasts, radio shows, and at vigils for other families. She pushed Alabama lawmakers to fund a state cold case unit, traveling to Montgomery with binders of statistics and Emily's photo pinned to her blazer. Her speeches grew sharper, her patience thinner. Law enforcement says cold case like it's a category, she told a Birmingham audience in 2013. But what it really means is our daughter is gone, and we've stopped looking. I will not stop looking. Karen's relentless energy strained her marriage further. Don had withdrawn almost completely into his workshop, sanding wood until his hands blistered. Their house became two worlds, Karen's filled with binders, maps, and ringing phones, Don's filled with silence and sawdust. The community in fragments. Fairhope itself had changed. New families moved in, unaware of Emily's story. Old residents still whispered, but less often. The vacant lot where her tracks had ended was now overgrown. The swing set collapsed into weeds. Children avoided it. Parents discouraged talk of it. The lot became a scar in the town's geography, passed quickly, never entered. At St. Augustine's, the piano keys remained untouched. A vase of fresh flowers still sat on the bench each Sunday, though some newer congregants no longer knew why. The church carried her absence like a tradition, a ritual that endured even as memory faded. A hint in 2013. In October 2013, a small but telling event occurred. Baldwin County Sheriff's deputies seized a box of maintenance supplies during an unrelated theft investigation at the Grayson County Medical Center, 40 miles north. Among the supplies were bottles of industrial-grade soap, the same type later identified in fibers from Emily's clothing. At the time, the connection wasn't made. The soap was just soap, the supplies just stolen goods. The evidence was logged and forgotten. But when cross-referenced years later, it would become part of the key. Detective Mendoza noted the seizure in her reports. She filed it under unrelated. But privately, she thought of the fibers on Emily's lavender dress, the faint residues. She scribbled a margin note, hospitals, maintenance staff, access late at night. It was speculation, nothing more. Yet it placed her one small step closer to the truth. Ellison's final collapse. By the end of 2013, Ellison's life had unraveled almost completely. He retired early, forced out by mounting disciplinary issues and concerns for his mental health. He was seen wandering Sycamore Street at night, flashlight in hand, muttering to himself. Some townsfolk pitied him. Others crossed the street to avoid him. He rented a small apartment above a laundromat, his walls papered with photographs of Emily. When Karen visited him one evening to share updates from a conference, she found him slumped in a chair, whiskey in hand, staring at the same tire tread photo he had carried for years. "It's still there," he whispered. "The answer's still there. We're just too blind to see it." Karen left in tears. Ellison had given his life to her daughter's case, but all it had given him back was ruin. The long silence by New Year's Eve 2013, nearly a decade had passed since Emily Harper vanished. Fairhope counted down to midnight under fireworks by the bay. But for Karen, Dawn, Ellison, and Mendoza, time meant nothing. It was just another marker of absence. Emily's lavender dress had vanished into daylight, and for 9 long years the town had lived with silence. But the truth was not gone. It lingered in fibers sealed in evidence bags, in a shaky signature on a church guest book, in soap residue dismissed as trivial. The puzzle pieces were already on the table. All that remained was for someone, years later, to finally put them together. By 2014, 10 years had passed since Emily Harper's lavender dress vanished into the spring air. A decade was long enough for new families to move to Fairhope, for children once in strollers to now sit in driver's ed, for the town itself to grow and change. But for those who remembered, the Harper case was a wound that had never healed. The story was no longer just a local tragedy. It had hardened into myth, whispered in Sunday school lessons and retold in quiet, uneasy voices. The 10th anniversary on March 7, 2014, St. Augustine's held a memorial service. The sanctuary filled with flowers, sunlight spilling across polished pews. Reverend Mayfield, older now, his hair turned silver, spoke of Emily's absence as a presence. "She is with us still," he said, his voice trembling. The choir sang without piano accompaniment. No one had ever taken her bench, and Karen Harper lit a single candle. The service was covered by local media, but briefly. A decade-old case was, to most journalists, a story with no ending. But for Karen, the 10th anniversary only sharpened her resolve. 10 years means nothing, she told a reporter outside the church. It could be 50. I'll still be looking. Karen's national voice in the years that followed, Karen Harper expanded her advocacy beyond Alabama. She appeared on national true crime podcasts, spoke at conferences in Chicago and New York, and connected with families of missing persons across the country. She helped organize a coalition that lobbied Congress for a federal cold case unit. Her speeches grew polished, her voice a mixture of grief and iron. "My daughter Emily didn't vanish into thin air. Someone took her. And the only reason we don't know who is because our system allows cases to freeze in file cabinets. Families are told to wait while the world forgets. We can't accept that. Not for Emily. Not for anyone." Karen became a symbol, though symbols are often lonely. Don Harper rarely traveled with her. He stayed in Fairhope, retreating deeper into his workshop. Their marriage had become a business partnership in grief. Karen the public face, Don the silent anchor. Ellison's shadow detective Mark Ellison, long retired, haunted the edges of Fairhope like a ghost. He lived in his small apartment above the laundromat, his walls still plastered with maps and photographs. Neighbors saw him wandering Sycamore Street at night, flashlight in hand, staring at the vacant lot where the swing set now lay collapsed in weeds. By 2015, he was a husk of the man who had once been Baldwin County's most respected investigator. His hair was thin, his clothes unkempt, his speech slurred by alcohol. Yet when anyone mentioned Emily's name, his eyes lit with a fierce clarity. "The answer's there," he'd mutter. "It's always been there." Some pitied him. Others avoided him. But Karen still visited, still listened to his ramblings about tire tracks and lavender dresses. She knew obsession when she saw it. She carried her own. Detective Mendoza, the long-game Detective Carla Mendoza, had now carried the Harper file for nearly 7 years. Most of her colleagues had stopped asking about it. But Mendoza never let it go. She understood that cold cases weren't solved by sudden lightning bolts of inspiration, but by the slow grind of persistence, waiting for science to catch up. In 2014, she submitted a request to retest fibers collected from Emily's lavender dress. Technology had advanced. Laboratories could now extract DNA from samples once considered unusable. The request was denied due to budget constraints. She submitted it again in 2015. Denied again. She filed it a third time in 2016, this time citing Emily's case as a high-profile example of community impact. The evidence was shipped quietly to the Alabama State Forensics Lab in Montgomery. While waiting for results, Mendoza combed through the case files once more. She returned to the guestbook signature, R. Vance. It had nagged at her for years. Robert Vance, nephew of Mrs. Vance. A maintenance supervisor at a county hospital. No record, no history of trouble. And yet, always on the periphery. Always present. Mendoza circled his name again in red ink, writing in the margin, "Never overlook the ordinary." Small clues. In late 2015, a hospital janitor in Mobile was arrested for unrelated theft charges. During questioning, he boasted about knowing a guy up in Baldwin County who got away with something big years back. Investigators dismissed it as jailhouse bravado, but Mendoza noted the detail. The janitor had once worked with Robert Vance. Meanwhile, Karen Harper received a letter in the mail, no return address, postmarked from Pensacola. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 typed words, "Ask about the nephew." Karen turned it over to Mendoza. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing but the words. But they lodged in Mendoza's mind. Fairhope's uneasy peace. By 2016, Fairhope had grown. New businesses lined Magnolia Avenue. The Bayfront hosted festivals again. Children who hadn't been born when Emily vanished now rode bikes past the vacant lot, though their parents warned them not to linger. St. Augustine's had a new pastor, Reverend Collins, younger and energetic, but he kept Emily's pew empty, her piano untouched. "Some absences," he told the congregation, "become part of who we are." Yet beneath the town's surface, unease remained. Everyone knew the Harper case was unsolved. Everyone knew it could happen again. Fairhope had learned to smile through the scar, but the scar still ached. Mendoza waits. In December 2016, the lab results from the retested fibers finally arrived. The samples had been degraded, fragile after 12 years in storage. But technology had advanced far enough to pull something from almost nothing. The report landed on Mendoza's desk just before Christmas. She read it once, then again. A partial male DNA profile. Not enough for identification yet, but enough to eliminate Derek Martinez, David Langford, Reverend Mayfield, and dozens of others who had been considered. It was the first true thread in more than a decade. Mendoza closed the file and sat in silence, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the room. She thought of Emily Harper's lavender dress, of the handbag on the church steps, of the faint smudges on piano sheet music. For the first time in years, she felt the ground shift. The answers were closer now. Still hidden, still buried in ordinary lives. But closer. By 2017, 13 years had passed since Emily Harper walked out of St. Augustine's and never made it home. In Fairhope, new subdivisions had risen, shops had opened, and children who once joined the search parties were now in college. But Emily's case remained unsolved, her name still a quiet specter whispered on anniversaries. For most residents, her disappearance had receded into local folklore, an unsolved mystery spoken of in the same tone as ghost stories. But for Detective Carla Mendoza, it was still very much alive. A partial DNA profile, the partial male DNA profile recovered from the fibers of Emily's lavender dress in 2016, had given Mendoza her first foothold. It wasn't enough for a match in Cody's, but it was enough to exclude Derek Martinez, the boyfriend, David Langford, the ex, Reverend Mayfield. Even Robert Vance, tested voluntarily in 2004, hadn't been compared with such sensitivity. Mendoza petitioned for expanded testing, sending the fibers to a private lab in North Carolina known for cutting-edge forensic work. Funding had to be cobbled together from state grants and donations from missing persons advocacy groups, many of them spurred by Karen Harper's relentless lobbying. By late 2017, the lab had extracted a more complete profile, still partial, but with enough loci to serve as a genetic fingerprint if compared directly to a suspect. For the first time, the case felt within reach. Mendoza's watch list. Mendoza built a short list of potential suspects based on proximity to Emily, access to the church, and opportunity. One name rose higher each time she reordered it: Robert Bob Vance, Mrs. Vance's nephew. On paper, Bob was ordinary. A maintenance supervisor at Gracet County Medical Center. Divorced, no children. lived 3 miles from Emily's bungalow, known for helping elderly neighbors with chores. But Mendoza kept circling back to him for reasons that were more instinct than evidence. He had been present at St. Augustine's that morning, his shaky signature, R. Vance, logged in the guest book. He had access to his aunt's property, where Emily had last been seen alive. He worked in an environment that used the same industrial-grade soap found on Emily's clothing fibers. And when questioned in 2004, he had seemed so unremarkable that no one ever considered him again. "Monsters don't always hide in shadows," Mendoza wrote in her notes. "Sometimes they sit in pews." Karen Harper's unyielding campaign. Meanwhile, Karen Harper had become a national figure in the missing persons community. In 2017, she appeared on a national morning show, clutching Emily's photograph as she spoke about cold cases. Her voice was steady now, honed by years of advocacy. "Every piece of evidence matters. Every file deserves another look. Time doesn't erase truth." She pushed Alabama lawmakers to expand DNA testing budgets, citing Emily's case as the example. Her persistence bore fruit. By 2018, the state approved new funding streams for cold case forensic analysis. But Karen's public crusade came at a cost. Don Harper, weary of the spotlight, withdrew further. Friends rarely saw him. He sold his woodworking tools. By the summer of 2018, their marriage was little more than a shared history bound by grief. Ellison in the dark. Former detective Mark Ellison had by now disappeared almost entirely from public view. Neighbors said they saw him occasionally, wandering with a notebook, muttering about tire tracks. His health declined, too much drinking, too little care. When Karen visited him in late 2017, she found him frail, his apartment stacked high with old evidence photocopies yellowing with time. "They're looking in the wrong places," he rasped. "It was right there, all along. Right there on the steps." Karen squeezed his hand. "Carla's still working it. She hasn't given up." Ellison's eyes watered. "Then she's the only one who hasn't." He died quietly in January 2018, alone in his apartment. His funeral was sparsely attended, but Karen placed a single photograph of Emily in his coffin. "You never stopped looking," she whispered. A town's uneasy silence. Fairhope itself had grown used to living with the unsolved. St. Augustine still left the piano untouched. Each March, a smaller vigil gathered. Younger residents, who hadn't been alive in 2004, treated the story like legend. The vacant lot where Emily's tracks ended had been sold to a developer, its rusting swing set bulldozed. In its place rose a row of tidy townhouses. But longtime residents muttered uneasily, "Building over bones doesn't bury the truth." Mendoza's push. In the summer of 2018, the North Carolina lab delivered its full report. The DNA profile from Emily's dress fibers was strong enough for direct comparison. Cody's had yielded no matches. The suspect had never been convicted of a crime. But if a sample could be obtained from an individual, it could confirm or eliminate them with near certainty. Mendoza drew up her list again. She crossed out names already cleared. Only a handful remained. At the top, underlined twice, Robert Vance. She began surveillance quietly. She drove past his modest home on Maple Street. She noted his routine, leaving for work at 6:45 a.m., returning by 3:30 p.m. He visited his elderly aunt daily at the nursing home until her passing in 2017. He mowed her lawn, carried her groceries, fixed leaky faucets for neighbors. He was quiet, dependable, almost invisible. But Mendoza had learned long ago that invisibility was sometimes camouflage. The waiting game to obtain a DNA sample legally required either consent or discarded material. In late 2018, Mendoza followed Vance after work. She watched him buy a soda at a gas station, sip it, and toss the can into a trash bin. She retrieved it within minutes, gloved hands sealing it in an evidence bag. The can was sent to the lab. Weeks passed. Christmas came and went. Karen lit another candle at St. Augustine's. Don stayed home. Then, in January 2019, the call came. The DNA profile from Robert Vance's soda can was a perfect match to the fibers found on Emily Harper's lavender dress. 13 years of silence cracked open with a single phone call. Mendoza sat at her desk, the phone pressed to her ear, her hand shaking as she scribbled the words, "It's him." For the first time since 2004, the Harper case had a name. Not a rumor, not a theory, a name. Robert Vance. And Fairhope had no idea that the quiet, dependable man who had helped search for Emily, who had sat in the same pews, who had offered condolences at vigils, had been hiding in plain sight for more than a decade. The call came in January 2019, and it changed everything. Detective Carla Mendoza had been waiting 13 years for a break, and now she had it. A perfect DNA match between the fibers on Emily Harper's lavender dress and a soda can tossed casually into a gas station bin by Robert Vance. The name had always sat quietly in the file, unremarkable, almost invisible. A nephew visiting his aunt at church. A maintenance man at a county hospital. A helpful neighbor. Nothing suspicious. Nothing memorable. But now his DNA was woven into Emily's clothing, like a ghost finally speaking after years of silence. Building the case Mendoza knew a match was only the beginning. DNA linked him to Emily's dress, but it didn't explain how, why, or what had happened. Prosecutors would need more. She launched a methodical background check into Robert Vance's life. What emerged was unsettling. Employment records confirmed he had worked late shifts at Grayson County Medical Center in early 2004, including the weekend Emily vanished. His job gave him access to institutional-grade soap, the same residue found on Emily's clothing fibers. Interviews with former hospital employees revealed whispers about Vance's behavior, an unusual interest in young female nurses, lingering too long in hallways, asking personal questions about where they lived and whether they walked home. Church records showed his signature in the guest book on March 7, 2004. He had been there, at St. Augustine's, that morning. It was enough to justify surveillance. Watching Robert Vance in February 2019, Mendoza and a small team began tailing Vance. He was 68 now, his once thick hair thinning to gray, his gait slower. He lived alone in a small house on Maple Street, curtains always half-drawn. To neighbors, he was still Bob, the helpful handyman. He fixed fences, shoveled driveways, mowed lawns. He was polite, quiet, dependable. No one suspected the storm gathering around him. But Mendoza noticed the cracks. He drank more now, whiskey bottles piling in his trash. He visited his aunt's grave at Millbrook Cemetery daily, kneeling for long stretches, lips moving in unheard conversations. His hands shook when unlocking his front door, his eyes darting nervously at passing cars. It was as though he could feel the walls closing in. The first interview on March 12, 2019, Mendoza invited Vance for a routine follow-up interview as part of a cold case review. He agreed, almost too readily, and arrived at the sheriff's office in a worn flannel shirt. At first, he was calm, answering questions in short, polite sentences. Yes, he remembered that Sunday in 2004. Yes, he had been at church with his aunt. No, he hadn't seen Emily after the service. Such a sweet girl, he said, shaking his head. But when Mendoza mentioned that new forensic testing had been conducted on old evidence, his composure faltered. His breathing quickened. He asked repeatedly whether he was free to leave. He excused himself to the restroom, where deputies outside the door heard him vomiting. When he returned, his hands trembled so badly, he gripped the chair to steady himself. Mendoza ended the interview early, but she had seen what she needed: fear. The pressure mounts. A second interview followed on March 18. This time, Mendoza told him DNA evidence had been recovered from fibers on Emily's dress. She didn't reveal the match yet. Vance's reaction was immediate. His face drained of color, his lips quivered, his eyes wet. He mumbled excuses about contaminated evidence, about science not being perfect. On March 25, during a third interview, Mendoza delivered the truth. Robert, the DNA we recovered matches yours. 13 years later, science doesn't lie. Vance broke. His chest heaved, his skin gray. He whispered, "I never meant for it to happen like that. She was such a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what I did." The words hung in the air like a confession. The confession what followed was fragmented, halting, punctuated by sobs. Vance described following Emily from his aunt's house that Sunday, offering to walk her home through the spring air. He claimed he had used his aunt's spare key to enter Emily's bungalow later, after she resisted his advances. He insisted her death was an accident, that she struck her head against the kitchen counter during a struggle. He admitted staging the scene, locking doors, slipping out through the basement window, obscuring his tracks in the snow while leaving Emily's visible. He had watched enough true crime television to know how to confuse investigators. And then he described loading her body into his maintenance truck and driving her where she could rest peacefully. But when pressed, he grew vague. He spoke of water and the old oak watching. Mendoza scribbled the phrases furiously. Peaceful water. Old oak. It was a confession, but not clarity. The arrest on April 2, 2019, Robert Vance was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Emily Harper. Sheriff Caldwell held a press conference the same afternoon. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, microphones crowded her face. For 15 years, this community has lived with unanswered questions, she said. Today, we can begin to provide those answers. Robert Vance has been arrested in connection with the disappearance and death of Emily Harper. Fairhope was stunned. The quiet handyman, the man who fixed fences and shoveled driveways, the nephew who had sat in pews at St. Augustine's, him? Some said they had always sensed something off. Others swore they never suspected. But no one remained untouched. Karen's reaction when Karen Harper received the call that morning, she collapsed into a chair. For 15 years she had begged for answers, fought for resources, screamed into silence. Now the answer had a name. She wept, not with relief but with grief renewed. She had dreamed of justice, but hearing Robert Vance's confession meant accepting that Emily was gone, violently taken. Don sat beside her, silent as always, but a single tear slipped down his cheek. That night, Karen lit another candle at St. Augustine's. "We know who," she whispered to the empty pew. "Now we just need to know where." The community shattered the arrest, cracked Fairhope open like stained glass. Some residents felt vindicated. "I knew it wasn't David Langford," one woman muttered at Rosie's Cafe. Others struggled to reconcile the helpful neighbor they'd known with the killer described on the news. At St. Augustine's, the congregation sat in stunned silence the following Sunday. Reverend Collins addressed it gently. "We must remember that evil can hide in the ordinary. But truth always rises, even if it takes years." For the first time in 15 years, the Harper case had moved forward. But the hardest truth remained buried. Emily's body had never been found. And until it was, closure was only an illusion. The arrest of Robert Vance in April 2019 shook Fairhope to its core. For 15 years he had been the quiet presence in the background, mowing lawns, fixing leaky roofs, attending vigils, kneeling beside his aunt at St. Augustine's. He had even signed the petitions Karen Harper passed around, nodding gravely as she spoke of her daughter's disappearance. Now he was led from his Maple Street home in handcuffs, his face pale and downcast, cameras capturing every second. The news traveled fast. Neighbors watched the footage on evening broadcasts, struggling to reconcile the soft-spoken handyman with the man detectives now called Emily Harper's killer. At Rosie's Cafe, forks clattered against plates as silence fell across the breakfast crowd. Some swore they'd always felt something off about him. Others insisted he was too kind, too ordinary. The truth shattered both camps. The search for Emily confession was one thing. Closure was another. In his fragmented statements, Vance had muttered about peaceful water and the old oak watching. Detectives scoured Baldwin and Gracet counties for places that fit. Creeks, ponds, bay inlets. Teams with ground-penetrating radar searched wooded lots. Volunteers combed shorelines. But weeks passed, then months, and Emily's body remained unfound. For Karen Harper, it was torture. She had her daughter's killer in custody, but not her daughter. She stood at press conferences clutching Emily's photograph, begging for help. "Please," she told cameras, her voice ragged. "Find my baby. Bring her home." Detective Mendoza refused to stop. She pored over topographic maps, historical records, satellite images. She revisited every word of Vance's confession, parsing his phrases like scripture. By the fall of 2019, a promising site emerged, a small overgrown pond behind an abandoned farm, shaded by a massive oak tree whose roots clawed into the water. Search teams descended. Mud was dredged, divers combed the pond floor, forensic experts sifted through sediment. After 3 days, bones surfaced, fragile, water-worn, but unmistakably human. Dental records confirmed it within a week. After 15 years, Emily Harper had been found. The trial, Robert Vance's trial, began in the spring of 2020, delayed slightly by procedural wrangling. He was charged with murder, evidence tampering, and abuse of a corpse. The courtroom in Mobile County was packed each day: reporters, townsfolk, Emily's family, even strangers who had followed the case for years. Prosecutors laid out their case: the DNA match from Emily's dress, the confession, the corroborating evidence of Vance's opportunity and knowledge of details never released publicly. They described how he had lured Emily, staged the scene, and hidden her body under the oak-shaded pond. Vance's defense argued accident. His attorney painted him as a lonely man who had made a terrible mistake, panicked, and covered it up. They claimed Emily's death was not premeditated murder, but a tragic accident during a struggle. Karen Harper sat through every day, her hands gripping Dawn's, her eyes fixed on Vance. When photographs of Emily's recovered remains were shown, she wept silently, but she did not leave the courtroom. "If she had to endure it," she later told a reporter, "so will I." The jury deliberated for 2 days. On June 18, 2020, they returned, guilty on all counts. Vance was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Aftermath: the verdict did not bring celebration. Fairhope was relieved, yes, but also hollowed out. For 15 years, Vance had lived among them. He had offered condolences at vigils, fixed neighbors' plumbing, carried groceries for elderly women. The betrayal cut deep. At St. Augustine's, Reverend Collins spoke carefully. Evil does not always arrive with horns and fangs. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, the smile of a helper. We cannot change what happened, but we can carry forward the light Emily brought into this world. Karen Harper spoke outside the courthouse. Justice doesn't mean joy. Nothing brings Emily back. But now at least we know. And we can lay her to rest. A funeral was held that summer, 16 years late. Emily's coffin, draped in white lilies, was lowered into Fairhope Cemetery. The choir sang the hymns she once played. Karen clutched Dawn's hand, their grief quiet but shared. The town gathered, some weeping openly, some standing stiff with guilt that they had doubted, speculated, or suspected the wrong men. Detective Mendoza's closure. For Detective Carla Mendoza, the case marked both triumph and burden. She had carried Emily's file for over a decade, and solving it became the defining achievement of her career. But when reporters asked how she felt, she replied quietly, "No detective celebrates putting someone in prison. We celebrate giving a family answers." She visited Ellison's grave after the sentencing. "Placing a single rose," she whispered, "you were right. It was always there. We just had to see it." Fairhope's scar. Fairhope moved forward, but it was never the same. The vacant lot where Emily's tracks had ended was now townhouses, their lawns neat, their windows bright. But longtime residents still felt a chill passing by. Rosie's Cafe instituted an annual scholarship in Emily's name for local students pursuing music. St. Augustine's finally allowed someone else to play the piano, though Emily's pew remained empty, always with fresh flowers. The Harper family carried on. Karen continued her advocacy, working with national organizations to push for cold case funding. Dawn, quieter, began building again in his workshop: chairs, tables, cabinets, each polished with care, some donated to churches and schools. "For Emily," he would say simply. The story of Emily Harper's disappearance became more than just a local tragedy. It became a testament to persistence, a mother who refused to stop, a detective who never gave up, a community that endured its darkest truth. And for every family still waiting for answers, Karen's words echoed: "Time doesn't erase truth. It just buries it deeper. And it is our job to keep digging until it's found."